It was a regular Wednesday afternoon when my husband Dan dropped a bit of a bombshell. He told me he'd been offered a week he was going on a long business trip overseas, leaving me alone in the house for the first time in years. I knew it was part of his job, but I was still anxious about being alone for that long. Dan packed his bags, kissed me goodbye and left with a cheerful smile, promising to check in every night. The house suddenly felt too big and too quiet. The first couple of days went by without much trouble. I worked from home, watched some TV and took long walks around the neighborhood. But on the third day, things changed. That evening, I was lounging on the couch. I was drinking tea when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was a bit curious but also a bit uneasy. I opened the door and saw Mark, Dan's best friend, standing there with a warm smile. "Hey, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in on you," he said casually, holding up a bottle of wine. "I know Dan's away and it must be a bit lonely." Mark and Dan had been friends since college. They had that easy, comfortable friendship that stood the test of time. We all hung out occasionally, but I never had much of a. I didn't get a chance to catch up with Mark. I never really had the chance to get to know Mark properly, as he was always around Dan. I was really grateful when he came over and we sat down to chat. We talked about work, shared a glass of wine and caught up on each other's news. It was great to have a good, long chat with him. I found myself laughing more than I had in days. Mark had always been charming, but I realized that I had never really paid attention to how genuinely kind and funny he could be. 2 hours had passed and we were still deep in conversation. There was something disarming about the way Mark listened. His attention was unwavering, which was refreshing and unfamiliar. I hadn't felt this kind of connection in a long time. As the evening wore on, Mark looked at me with a new intensity. It wasn't inappropriate, but it was different. There was a moment where the air between us shifted, but neither of us acknowledged it. I brushed it off, convinced it was just my imagination. After all, Mark was Dan's best friend, and I was Dan's wife. There was no way Mark would ever cross that line. I quickly changed the subject. I told Mark I needed to get to bed, as I could sense that the night had gone on long enough. He smiled, thanked me for the company and left without hesitation as I closed the door. I couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered in the air. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. The next morning, I woke up feeling a bit off. The evening with Mark had played on my mind more than it should have. I told myself it was nothing, just the result of having company. I was feeling unusually vulnerable with Dan gone, yet there was this nagging voice in the back of my head, replaying the subtle shift in the air between us. I tried to busy myself with work, trying to shake off the thoughts, but they crept in at unexpected moments, like when I was making coffee and glanced at the couch where we had talked the night before. What bothered me more was that I was thinking about Mark at all. This was someone I've known Mark for years. He's always been in the background of my life, just a friendly face. But recently, I've been noticing him in a different way. By the afternoon, I couldn't resist the urge to talk to someone I called my friend, Lily. She's the one person who would listen without judgment. So Mark came by last night. I started trying to sound casual, like Mark, Dan's friend. Lily's tone was immediately curious, just to check in on me. I guess we had after a few glasses of wine, we started chatting. It was nice, but I was a bit hesitant at first. Lily kept pushing me, though, so I gave in. I took a deep breath and started talking. There was this moment I can't explain. It wasn't anything specific, but it felt like something. Lily was silent for a beat, and I quickly added that it wasn't anything in particular. It was more like a feeling, like we were both aware of something we weren't supposed to be. Lily hummed thoughtfully. "That's tricky. I mean, he's Dan's best friend. Maybe it was just the wine talking." "Maybe," I replied, though. Deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on anything but that conversation. But Mark seemed to occupy every corner of my mind. It was absurd. He was just being a good friend. I was overthinking it because I was lonely that evening. I sat down for dinner alone. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. "I had a great time last night. I hope I didn't overstay my welcome." I stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. I typed out a few different replies before settling on a simple "not at all." It was nice to have company. A few minutes later, he replied, "I was glad to hear that I was thinking of stopping by again tomorrow." I told him I was free, but I didn't want to put any pressure on him. Part of me wanted to say no to avoid whatever this was turning into, but the other part, the one who had been lonely and bored for days, was tempted. I told myself it was just another visit from a friend. "Sure, tomorrow works," I replied before I could overthink it. The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy. I couldn't stop thinking about what I was doing. Was I setting myself up for something I couldn't control? Or was this all in my head? That evening, Mark arrived again, this time with takeout. We sat at the kitchen table eating and talking like we had the other night, but this time the energy between us was even more intense. Every laugh and every glance felt heavier, as though we were both skirting around something unspoken. At one point, I caught him staring at me for a longer than usual, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I quickly looked away, feeling the weight of guilt settle in. "This is ridiculous," I thought to myself. "He's Dan's friend. Nothing is going to happen." But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt drawn to the idea of letting something happen. And that was terrifying. As the evening wore on, it became clear that whatever had been brewing the night before was still there. We danced around it with small talk and casual conversation, but the tension was undeniable. Then, without thinking, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned. "Mark, do you ever wonder what would happen if we weren't tied to other people?" He looked at me, surprised but not shocked. There was a pause, and then he answered. His voice was quiet. "I thought about it more than I should. I hadn't expected that." My heart raced, and I felt a strange mixture of excitement and panic. "I don't want to ruin anything between you and Dan." His words hit me hard, and I realized how close we were to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. "Yeah," I whispered, "I love Dan." Mark leaned back, exhaling deeply. "I know and I respect that," he said, "but I won't lie, it's hard being around you sometimes. There's this connection that I can't ignore." For a long moment, we sat in silence for a while, both of us. We were both aware of what was going on, and we'd both realized that we didn't want to be in this situation. There was no way back now, though, as Mark got up to leave. He looked at me one last time and said, "I should go before we make a mistake." I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as he walked out the door. The house felt even emptier after he left, and I was left to face the complicated mess of emotions swirling inside me the day after Mark's second visit. I woke up feeling a mix of relief and dread. Part of me was glad we'd had the sense to come to our senses, but the other part couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to doing something that could shatter my marriage. Dan called later that morning to check in from his trip. His voice was warm and familiar, but I couldn't shake the guilt that was sitting with me. I listened to him talk about his meetings and colleagues. I listened to him talk about his meetings and how much he missed me. Each word felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I found myself responding automatically, trying to sound upbeat and normal, but I was far from it. I felt like I was living in two worlds, one where I was Dan's loving wife and another where Mark had stirred feelings I wasn't ready to confront. Later that evening, I decided to call Mark just to make sure everything was still normal between us. I didn't want things to be awkward, but I also needed to make sure we were both on the same page and that nothing had changed. "Hey," I said when he answered, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to make sure we're okay, after last night." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Yeah, we're fine," he said, but his voice lacked the easygoing tone he usually had. "Are you sure? I don't want things to be weird between us." I let out a little sigh. "Look, it's not weird, but I think we need to be careful. Whatever this is, it's dangerous for both of us." I knew he was right. I agree. I don't want to mess things up. Neither do I. He said, but it's hard. You know, I've been thinking about you a lot more than I should. I know that's wrong. Dan's my best friend. You're his wife. His honesty was disarming. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I'd been feeling the same way, and hearing him admit it out loud made everything seem more real. We have to stop this, Mark. I finally said, my voice firm. Whatever this is, it can't go any further. I love Dan, and I can't hurt him like that. Mark's voice softened. I know. I get it. I don't want to hurt him either. There was a long silence between us, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. I knew we had to put an end to this tension between us, whatever it was, but the more I tried to convince myself, the more when we hung up, I realized how hard it was going to be. I felt a strange sense of finality. Mark and I couldn't be anything more than friends, I told myself. Despite that, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss. Something had shifted between us and there was no going back. The next few days passed in a blur. I threw myself into work to keep busy. I was trying to avoid thinking about Mark and the complicated emotions swirling inside me. Dan, I was due back in a couple of days and I was determined to put all of this behind me before Dan returned, but things didn't go as planned. The day before Dan was supposed to come home, I got a text from Mark saying, "Can we talk?" I knew I shouldn't respond, but something in me couldn't resist. I couldn't leave things unresolved. I typed back, feeling a pit in my stomach that evening. Mark came over again. I had promised myself this would be the last time we would have one final conversation to clear. We were both hoping that we could just put it all behind us and go back to our normal lives. But as soon as he walked in, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. We sat on the couch, both of us avoiding eye contact for a while. There was a real sense of tension in the air. "I'm sorry," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. "I shouldn't have texted you. I've been struggling with everything and I didn't know what else to do." I shook my head. "It's not your fault. This whole thing just got out of hand. We should have never let it get this far." Mark looked at me, his expression serious. "I know. But I can't stop thinking about you, and that's the problem. I don't want to feel this way, but I do." I swallowed hard, feeling my own emotions rise to the surface. "We can't do this, Mark. It's not fair to Dan, and it's not fair to either of us." He nodded slowly. "You're right. It's not fair, but it doesn't make it any easier for a moment." Neither of us spoke. The weight of everything hung between us, unspoken but understood. I could feel the pull between us. The temptation to let something happen, to give in to whatever this is. I knew that if we crossed that line, there would be no turning back. "I can't do this," I whispered to myself. Mark stood up, running a hand through his hair. I know I should go, but neither of us moved. We were both frozen in place, standing on the edge of a precipice. We didn't want to fall into it. Finally, Mark turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at me. With that, I knew he'd made his decision. As soon as the door closed behind him, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had made the right choice, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like I had lost something important, something I hadn't even realized I wanted. The next day, Dan came home. His warm embrace was familiar and comforting, but I felt a distance within myself that I couldn't explain. I smiled, laughed at his stories, and fell back into the rhythm of our life together. But something had changed. Mark and I didn't speak again after that. That night, we avoided each other, agreeing to let whatever had almost happened fade into the background. It was easier that way, safer. As time passed, the tension dissolved into memory, but it left a mark. It was a reminder that even the strongest boundaries can bend under the weight of unspoken feelings. I never crossed that line, but I knew I had come dangerously close. Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to this channel for more videos.